join our headlines on this Friday afternoon, July 15th. South Korean health authorities have announced well over 38,000 new COVID-19 infections on this Friday and have renewed calls on those eligible to seek a second booster dose. Eco-friendly South Korean cars are expanding their presence both in the domestic and foreign markets, growing over 30% on year, with exports alone totaling $7 billion roughly during the first half of 2022. And over in the US, producer prices jumped 11.3% on year in June, exceeding expectations by market pundits amid soaring energy expenses. We begin on the pandemic front here in South Korea, where the daily tally has hit well above 38,000 cases amid the summer travel season and the presence of a stronger variant that is fueling higher community transmissions. Accordingly, authorities for their part are cautioning against complacency and for attention on basic prevention measures. Our Chung Eun-ju starts us off.
South Korea's new cases of COVID-19 have more than doubled in the space of a week amid the spread of the highly contagious Omicron subvariant BA.5. The nation on Thursday confirmed its first case of the Centaurus subvariant, also known as BA.275. According to the KDCA, the first case is a man in his 60s living in the city of Incheon. This person has no overseas travel history and will quarantine for 7 days like others infected with COVID-19. Authorities are conducting investigations to confirm the route of infection and said that it is likely that the virus has already spread within the local community. The Centaurus subvariant was first detected in India in early May and has since spread to more than 10 countries. The BA.275 variant is known to have accumulated enough mutations to evade antibodies formed by vaccines or prior infections. The uptick is attributed to the BA.5 mutation that escapes immunity and which already accounts for 40% of confirmed cases in the Seoul metropolitan area. If the current surge continues, experts calculate that South Korea will confirm around 100,000 new cases by next week, and could even lock 300,000 per day in around 4 weeks from now if the basic reproduction number increases by 30%. As a preemptive measure, the government said it will secure an additional 1,400 hospital beds for people who are critically ill. Meanwhile, as BA.5 becomes the dominant strain worldwide, the World Health Organization has warned that the pandemic is nowhere near over.
New waves of the virus demonstrate again that the COVID-19 is nowhere near over. As the virus pushes at us, we must push back.
CNN calls BA.5 the worst variant yet. The White House said U.S. President Joe Biden would minimize contact during his first trip to the Middle East. Chung Eun-ju, Arirang News.
And for the first time in 13 years, the value of the South Korean won lost significant ground against the US dollar. Minutes after the market opened on this Friday morning, the local currency traded at 1,323.80 won against the greenback. The won had closed at 1,312.10 won the day prior. Now, the last time the won's value marked a similar slide against the US dollar was during intraday trading on April 30th, 2009. Pundits are linking Friday's slide to rampant fears about a global recession and the US Federal Reserve's aggressive rate hikes to stem inflation. Separately, the South Korean stock market also opened down on Friday, with the benchmark Kospi surrendering 0.34% during the first 15 minutes of trading. The government is seeking to ensure a safety net to protect the financially vulnerable from excessive debt burden in light of the central bank's latest interest rate hike. Our presidential office correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol vowed to implement policy measures aimed at easing the debt burden on those in the low-income bracket and young people at a time of increasing interest rates.
금리 인상은 물가 상승을 억제하기 위한 불가피한 조치이지만 그 부담이 고스란히 취약계층과 사회적 약자에게 전가돼서는 안 될 것입니다.
The remarks came at his weekly meeting on the economy, the second of its kind, held a day after the nation's central bank raised the policy interest rate by 0.5 percentage point to fight inflation, marking the biggest single rate hike on record. Since August last year, the Bank of Korea has raised its benchmark rate to 2.25% from a record low of 0.5% in order to dampen an inflation rate, which last month quickened to its highest since the late 90s. Government measures announced on Thursday include extending maturity or reducing interest rates for small business owners, shifting to lower rates for a certain group of borrowers, creating a special program for young borrowers, and lowering borrowing rates for home buyers.
서민 경제가 무너지면 국가 경제의 기본이 무너지는 것입니다. 고물가, 고금리의 부담이 서민과 취약계층에 전가되지 않도록 관계 기관은 각별히 신경 써 주실 것을 당부드립니다.
During the president's meeting with top government officials, the Financial Services Commission reported that it would expand a program to help low-income borrowers switch adjustable rate mortgage loans to fixed-rate loans at affordable rates. Data from FSC show households in South Korea had over $1.4 trillion of debt at the end of 2021, equivalent to about 90% of the nation's GDP. It also shows adjustable rate loans accounted for 46% of the debt. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
And the import price index rose for a second straight month to hit a fresh high in June on the back of skyrocketing oil prices. According to the Bank of Korea Friday, the overall import price index for last month, that is, stood at 154.84, up 0.5% from May. Compared to a year earlier, import prices have risen nearly 34%, showing on-year increases for 16 straight months. The central bank has linked the surge to historic highs in global oil prices, with the price of Dubai crude, Korea's benchmark, rising around 58% on year. Export prices also rose. Compared to the year before, export prices were up around 24% in June, led by petroleum and chemical products. Eco-friendly South Korean cars are making greater inroads into the local as well as overseas markets. In fact, overseas shipments saw a record high for roughly the first half of this year. Our Kim Do-yeon has details.
Gas guzzlers are waning in popularity while demand for eco-friendly green cars is accelerating. 1 in 4 cars sold in South Korea in the first half of this year were eco-friendly. Kia's Sportage HEV and EV6 and Hyundai's Ioniq 5 were some of the most popular models. Both domestic demand and exports have climbed more than 30% on year, while exports topped $7 billion for the first time. High overseas demand for these sustainable cars has pushed South Korea's motor companies Hyundai and Kia up into the top 5 of the global EV market. Exports were strong not only for green cars but also for South Korean cars in general. More than 1 million cars were sold overseas in the first half of the year, up 1.5% from the year before. In total, more than $24 billion of cars were sold, marking a 3% on-year rise. The robust exports seem all the more impressive considering that the automobile industry is still wrestling with overseas supply chain problems. Semiconductor supply is still on shaky ground, with China still locking down major cities to contain COVID-19. Also, because South Korea recorded the third highest car sales last year, this year's domestic sales seemed weak in comparison. Both these factors brought down domestic production and demand. Production fell 2% on year, while demand tumbled more than 11%. But with South Korean motor labels constantly innovating to create cutting-edge new models, like the soon-to-be-released Ioniq 6 and the 2023 version of the Ioniq 5, the domestic car industry is heading for a bright future. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
In the U.S., producer prices exceeded expectations by rising higher in response to escalating energy expenses. The latest data also saw the stock market there surrendering heavily from opening bell Thursday. Our Lee Kyung-won reports.
With the U.S. economy hit hard by inflation, wholesale prices in the country climbed to a near record level last month. The U.S. Labor Department reported on Thursday that the U.S. Producer Price Index, a measure of price changes before goods are sold to a consumer, rose 11.3% in producer prices. U.S. stocks plummeted from the opening bell on Thursday. The blue chip Dow was down 1.97%. The S&P 500 fell 1.88% and the tech-heavy Nasdaq 1.71%. This comes after consumer prices were reported to have soared 9.1% on-year in June, the biggest reading in 4 decades. And because of higher producer prices.
Meanwhile, the number of Americans seeking unemployment benefits for the first time is on a rapid rise, reaching 244,000 in the week ending July 9th. The latest figure marks a near 8-month high after 9,000 additional claims were added last week. However, in terms of the total number of Americans collected,
we will share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean survivor of Japan's wartime slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
Protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Howdy ho. What matters?
Feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good, but right now, maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now, forever.
Welcome back. The ease in pandemic-related travel restrictions and the ensuing surge in travelers to popular tourist destinations has redirected the spotlight onto a growing global dilemma. On Viewpoint today, we address over-tourism. And for this, I have Professor Jerry Agrusa at the University of Hawaii at Manoa live on the line. Professor Agrusa, a warm welcome to you.
Aloha, everybody. Good evening.
Right. I also have Professor Umair Zaman at the Endicott College of International Studies. Professor Zaman, it's a pleasure.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Right. Professor Agrusa, we'll start with you then. Now, for the sake of clarity, perhaps we could start with the definition of the term over-tourism. How would you define it?
Well, over-tourism is any time there's too many tourists at a destination. And it could be anything from a major city, such as what's experienced a lot in, for instance, in Europe right now, in Italy. Venice is a city and Florence are both cities that have been overwhelmed by hordes of tourists. And it could be as small as a festival or an event where there's just too many tourists and not enough space, whether for parking or for people to stay in hotels, to get a chance to visit that destination. So it could be as broad as a big city. You know, in Europe, there's other cities that had huge over-tourism pushback, such as Amsterdam, and even sometimes even London.
Right, and that being said, Professor Zaman, here in South Korea, which local tourist destinations do you believe face over-tourism, and how severe is the situation here in South Korea as compared to places elsewhere?
Well, I believe that this COVID-19 pandemic has changed the situation of over-tourism in South Korea and elsewhere around the world, right? Because since the pandemic had started, this COVID-19, this over-tourism has gone into hibernation, right? So in year 2020, South Korean economy lost $33 billion just because of decline of international travel by 85%. Last year, 2021, there was a decline of 62%, right? So we don't see that over-tourism right now since the pandemic had started. But again, there is a slight return of tourism. People are now, there's emergence of revenge travel. People want to travel more, they want to spend more, and they do not want to cancel their trips, right? And Korea is also now facing that situation. So if we see the list of more popular destinations facing over-tourism in Korea, I think the top of the list is Seoul, which attracts the largest influx of international travelers. And within Seoul, there are traditional Korean villages which have a low population, and then they have influx of large volume of international tourists. Then we have Jeju, a city, last year during the pandemic had attracted around 12 million visitors, and that figure is going to double very soon in the next 5 or 10 years. Then, so this pandemic is it really changes the situation from over-tourism to lack of tourism.
Right, for the moment though, that is, right? Professor Agrusa, what can you tell us about over-tourism over there in Hawaii and its repercussions?
Well, Hawaii experienced, just like the professor mentioned, that we had too many tourists. So from 2009 to 2019, we went from 6.3 million tourists to 10.4 million tourists. And with that huge growth, we're the only islands state in the United States, and we have about 1.2 million residents. So, and because we're such a far distance, people don't come for a day or two. They come for a week or 10 days. Then in 2019, after 2019, once the COVID pandemic started, we actually had a complete lockdown in March of 2020, and we had no tourism. So we went from the lowest unemployment to the highest, lowest unemployment in the United States, below 3%, to the highest unemployment in the United States in 1 month. So we had over 200,000 people lose their jobs in 1 month. And when that happened, you can see that there was huge ramifications economically for the state. And I think the local residents started to understand exactly how much economically the tourism is for the state of Hawaii.
Right, it did, of course. Professor Zaman, you mentioned the pandemic earlier. Now, some say that the pandemic itself has served to perhaps raise greater awareness about the problems associated with over-tourism. Do you agree?
Yeah, to some extent, I agree. But again, keeping the context of this pandemic, it has not only raised the concerns about the pre-pandemic conditions of over-tourism, but it has dramatically changed the awareness and concerns about climate change and climate awareness, right? And call for action, more efforts towards how we can, we see like recently, because of the pandemic, we see a lot of improvement, a significant amount of reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, right? And that improves the air quality, like in every tourism destination, including Seoul, which always struggled with air pollution and air quality, right? So now for the policymakers, tourism planners, and stakeholders, they need to strategically think that how this positive effects of this pandemic on the environment are not reversed by this growing tourism, right? So now policymakers are thinking about like how this growing tourism should become the part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Right, and that being said, Professor Agrosa, there are efforts, indeed, as Professor Zaman has mentioned, efforts to address over-tourism. They're taking tangible form as we speak, as well in destinations like in Hawaii. Now, that being said, Professor Agrosa, what can you share with us about the regenerative tourism campaign that is in place there over in Hawaii?
Well, first is, what is the definition of regenerative tourism? And then with that, we here in Hawaii say, we have a statement that says, leave the island better than when you arrived. Give back, show that it'll be sustainable for not just when you come back again, but for the next generation. So that's what we're hoping for. And what we've done is the Hawaii Tourism Authority had started a program called the Malama Project. And that is where they are trying to show both the tourists as well as the residents what is expected when they come and when they visit our destinations. And one of the things that people are doing is tourists are coming in, they're helping with beach cleanups. They're helping with, on Kauai, for instance, they're over there helping get fishing nets, removing plastics, things such as this. On hiking trails, there have been a number of times where they go in, take out invasive species on the hiking trail, so that they're not just coming and enjoying, they're not just sustaining, but they're actually making it better than when they arrived. And it's amazing how many tourists really want to do this. And we did another study on asking people on their willingness to pay for sustainable activities. And then over 75% of those folks who responded, the tourists responded, said that they'd be willing to pay extra money to be involved in sustainable activities. So it's not that you just want to be involved; they're willing to pay for it. So that's just one of the aspects that's happening here in Hawaii, that we're trying to introduce the tourists to both regenerative tourism and some of the sustainable activities that are involved. One of the things, it's because Hawaii is such a desolate, isolated island. We're 5,000 kilometers from the nearest landmass. We have this huge carbon footprint when people fly here. And a lot of tourists come here, and the first thing they want to do is plant trees to offset their carbon footprint.
Right, that is good to know. Professor Zaman, I understand regenerative tourism seeks to tackle 3 impacts, and they include the environment, the economy, and society, the social consequences, that is, of tourism itself. Could you tell us a bit about the economic aspect of over-tourism?
Okay, so because it has a manifold impact, and because we recently published an article on regenerative tourism, and that focuses on how to counterbalance the effects, the social, economic, and environmental effects. So we make certain recommendations in our articles. That means the mindset of tourism stakeholders, it has to completely change from extractive mindset, that means the consumption of resources, and focusing on economic gains or just seeking profit only. It should be more about realignment of values among people and the nature, and it should be sharing of economic gains among stakeholders, and also like paying for this carbon emissions. Like if you are traveling and having long flights, you can also pay extra contributions to offset that emission during your flights. Likewise, some proportion of the travel revenues should be also spent on safeguarding endangered species. So that can also create a regenerative impact in those destinations.
Right, and staying with the impact of over-tourism, Professor Agrosa, what would be the social ramifications of over-tourism and ways to overcome them under the regenerative tourism campaign?
Well, one of the challenges that we had faced here in Hawaii in 2019 with the, the record number of 10.4 million tourists, every other year the Tourism Authority does a resident sentiment analysis survey. And we ask them many questions, but one of the top questions is, do you believe that tourism brings more benefits than challenges for the resident population? And for the first time, under 60% of the residents who answered the survey said that they felt, only 60% felt that tourism brings more benefits than challenges. When they first started doing the survey, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, it was up close to 80%. So you had this decrease in the residents' perception of tourism. And what regenerative tourism is to not just help the environment, but also help the local population. And we're hoping that when we have more regenerative tourism here, that the local residents will see the benefits of it. Now, the majority of tourists that come to Hawaii are good tourists. They really are. And what the Tourism Authority, as well as the local government, we have the Business and Economic Development arm of the local government, they need to go out and share these findings and these knowledge with the local residents. Because sometimes the local residents only see the traffic or only go to a beach park and find out that there's no parking and they see tourists there. And they only look at the negative, not understanding that their neighbors' jobs are probably totally dependent on tourism coming here, which we saw when we had the lockdown with the pandemic in 2020.
Right. I guess on all fronts, and education on both sides would be very important. Professor Zaman, if South Korea were to implement the regenerative tourism campaign, where would you advise it be implemented and what methods would you recommend?
Actually, right now, the Korean government, the cultural ministry is already, they have a strategy, urban regeneration, and that is cultural-led regeneration. So they have this strategy is based on about inspiration from Spain and Austria. But what I see is the foremost problems faced by Korea in terms of environmental impact is air pollution and ocean pollution, right? So Seoul is counted as one of those cities in the world which has the worst quality of air pollution, right? So in order to, although the Korean government is using all the forms of technology, 5G and artificial intelligence, drone technology, but I think the contribution from travelers, inbound travelers, that can also make a major impact. And if we see that the way they travel and how they consume resources in Seoul, inside Korea, that can also have an environmental impact. That means even shifting, making a minor change, shifting on the way they travel. That means using tour buses, bicycles, or even preferably travel rather than renting out a car. I think that can also create some impact. And in terms of ocean pollution, according to statistics, like 67,000 of tons of plastic waste is extracted from the ocean life annually, and that is a major problem right now. So those travelers who want to experience scuba diving in South Korea, they can also create a positive regenerative impact. That means they can help to trace and remove that tons of plastic from the ocean life.
Right.
And just to add on that, there are several, Korea is popular because of beaches, but some of the beaches are becoming more polluted, right? And take example of Daecheon Beach. Every day, 30 tons of litter is left behind by visitors, right? So if foreign tourists, if they come to the beaches, they engage the local community in terms of greater awareness about environment, and also develop some civic sense, consciousness, that can also have a large regenerative impact on those destinations.
Right, a very valid point, Professor Zaman. And beyond Korea and Hawaii, Professor Agusa, what are your thoughts on Venice's planned adoption of tourist fees for day travelers to the city?
Well, for instance, excuse me, Venice is an unusual case, right? They're overwhelmed. One of the biggest challenge with Venice is we have these huge cruise ships that come in, and a cruise ship will dock, and then, or they're so big they can't even dock. Their docks are not even large enough to handle them. And then they have pilot boats that bring all these tourists off the ship. Now, the challenge is tourism is supposed to be an employer, right? We're supposed to make jobs with this. When you have a person on a cruise ship, one of the things at a cruise ship is you sleep on the cruise ship and you eat on the cruise ship, right? You pay one fee and all your food is covered for you, whether it's a 7-day or a 10-day. Now, I do go on cruises. I haven't been on since the pandemic, but I like cruise ships. The challenge with that in Venice is you have these big, 4,000, 5,000 passenger ships come, they dock, and then you have 20, 30,000 people come off the ship and walk the streets and crowd the streets. They might eat a lunch, but they don't stay in hotels. And when your person stays in hotels, that causes employment, right? You have a front desk person, you might have a bellman, you have management, you have a hotel tax. And this is very, very important for the city and the destination. And when tourists just come and go, that's not what you want. You want a tourist to stay and produce jobs. And this is where Venice is at a huge disadvantage by these massive cruise ships coming in and people. Also, they're overwhelmed by tourists coming on the land as well. So you have two sectors that are actually overwhelming the tourism in the city of Venice. And I think that having a visitor tax is a smart thing. I think that here in Hawaii, we're thinking of it, and I think we should do it too. We should have it go directly to regenerative and help do for sustainability.
Right. Yep. And Professor Zaman, are there any other options to ensure a sustainable, pleasurable travel experience to a foreign place, do you think?
Of course, there are plenty of options, but just focusing on the most important one right now is that I think the tourism experience, tourists, from their perspective, the tourism should not be a meaningful experience, not only for the travelers, but also it should have a meaningful impact on the local community as well as the environment. Right now, I think choosing a destination which requires immediate support, that matters the most, right? And if you see, like right now, Sri Lanka is suffering from the worst economic crisis on record. And one of the major sources of their revenues was tourism. They lost 70% of their tourism, declined because of this COVID-19 pandemic, right? So I think to make tourism more meaningful, pleasurable, impactful, sustainable, and helping communities with a regenerative mindset, I think people should think about traveling to Sri Lanka if they have to travel.
Right, I see. All right, Professor Zaman, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Agusa, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much. Mahalo, everyone.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
In Ukraine, Russia's brutal assaults against civilians continue, and this time the target was a city far from the war-torn Donbas region. Our Kim Hyo-san reports.
Russia has fired missiles targeting a Ukrainian city far from the eastern front line, killing nearly 24 people and wounding many others. A number of children were among the dead.
Today, in the morning, Russian missiles hit the city of Vinnytsia, an ordinary peaceful city. Cruise missiles hit 2 community facilities. Houses were destroyed. A medical center was destroyed. Cars and trams were on fire. This is an act of Russian terror.
Local authorities say the missiles struck civilian buildings in the west-central Ukrainian city on Thursday morning. They note the missiles first hit the car park of a 9-story building, adding that residential buildings were hit a little later. Following the strike, a Ukrainian Air Force spokesperson said that the city had been hit by 3 Russian-caliber cruise missiles fired from a submarine. Authorities added that the Ukrainian forces had shot down 2 other missiles. The Russian Defense Ministry, which denies targeting civilians, has yet to comment on the strike. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Here on the local front, South Korean Air Forces and their U.S. counterparts have ended 4 days of joint drills that included F-35A fighter jets for the first time in a show of strength against Pyongyang's persistent provocations. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Bae Eun-ji has more.
A South Korean F-35A stealth fighter roars into the air at an airbase in Cheongju to take part in joint air drills with F-35As from the U.S. On Thursday, the last day of the 4-day combined exercise, the South Korean Air Force said this is the first time the allies have held a joint drill using F-35As from both countries. The training involved a total of around 30 warplanes and also included South Korea's F-15Ks, KF-16s, and FA-50s, as well as F-16s from the U.S.
This training is very important as a symbol of our strong alliance and joint defense readiness. Pilots will be sharing tactics and skills needed for this fifth-generation jet.
Last Tuesday, 6 American F-35A stealth fighters from Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska arrived in South Korea for this drill. This was the first time in more than 4 years that they were publicly deployed here. A U.S. Air Force F-35A pilot also said the training is aimed at showing the two countries' strong alliance.
Our primary objective is to safely execute tactics between us and ROKAF F-35s to show our ironclad alliance here in South Korea.
Designed to evade radar detection, the F-35A has a top speed of Mach 1.8. South Korea currently has around 40 F-35As and plans to purchase around 20 of them more in the next few years, at a cost of almost $3 billion. The joint training comes amid heightened tensions, with North Korea showing signs of preparing for its first nuclear test in 5 years. This also appears to be in line with the agreement made by the South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and U.S. President Joe Biden in their summit in May to deploy U.S. strategic military assets to the Korean Peninsula. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
The South Korean task force in charge of addressing the ongoing dispute over wartime forced labor during Japanese colonial rule met for a second session earlier on Thursday. Our Kim Da-mi has more on what was addressed.
South Korea says it's willing to negotiate with Japan on invoking the diplomatic protection requested by Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor, even though it would not meet the legal requirements. Diplomatic protection is when a state acts on behalf of its citizens when their rights have been violated by another state. An official from Seoul's Foreign Ministry explained that the issue is a civil lawsuit against the actions of a number of firms, not the state. This came after the second meeting of the new joint consultative body organized by South Korea took place on Thursday to find a solution. The subrogation payment was also high on the agenda of Thursday's talks. That's when the South Korean government pays the victims and then asks the Japanese companies for reimbursement later.
We explained to the South Korean government that the Japanese firm's participation is essential in at least collecting the funds for the subrogation.
The victim side also stressed that the related firms, namely Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel Corporation, must apologize to the victims, while the Japanese government should also apologize.
We have asked the South Korean government to explain to the Japanese government that this is an opportunity for Japan to resolve the prolonged matter too.
Japan's NHK News reported the same day that Seoul's top diplomat Park Jin is set to visit Japan on Monday, where he could discuss the wartime forced labor issue with his counterpart Yoshimasa Hayashi during his 4-day trip there. The South Korean task force plans to hold more meetings on the issue before the liquidation of the Japanese company's assets actually takes place. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
And now, for those of you who have yet to make weekend plans, a trip to the southern port city of Busan may be worth your while, especially amid the start of the city's motor show on this Friday, featuring green cars and more. My colleague Choi Min-jung was there.
If you want to check out the latest car models before anyone else, the Busan International Motor Show 2022 is the place to be. The 10-day event begins on Friday at the Busan Exhibition and Convention Center in South Korea's port city of Busan under the theme Next Mobility, a Celebration.
Next mobility means future mobility. As you may have noticed, most of the vehicles displayed here are electric. We also wanted the public to enjoy themselves as if they were at a festival, because the show is being held for the first time in 4 years due to the pandemic.
120 companies from 8 countries are at this year's event. You can find domestic brands from Hyundai Motors, Kia, and Genesis, as well as foreign brands including BMW, Mini, and Rolls-Royce. So what are some models to look out for in 2022? Hyundai Motor is revealing its latest electric vehicle, the Ioniq 6, for the very first time for people to see in person. The electric sedan is set to be released this September.
The Ioniq 6 offers customers not only a new mobility experience, but also a unique experience based on an eco-friendly lifestyle.
Kia is debuting a compact SUV, the all-new Seltos, with a bold design and high-tech features.
We believe the most natural solutions will take precedence over the amount of technology. This is also reflected in the interior of the new Kia Seltos, so that consumers can use new technologies intuitively, comfortably, and naturally.
Both Hyundai Motors and Kia are showcasing electric concept vehicles that were both unveiled for the first time at the 2021 LA Auto Show. Hyundai's Ioniq Concept 7 and Kia's EV9 drew attention given the lack of electric SUVs in the market.
But the show is not just about cars. People can also see and experience what the next generation of mobility might look like.
SK Telecom is providing a virtual experience of what it would feel like to ride an air taxi. The company has been playing an active role in the country's urban air mobility industry with aims to commercialize air taxis by 2025. As the theme suggests, the auto show is a platform for people to enjoy. People can test drive cars, from the luxurious new Genesis to racing cars, and end the tour with some beer afterward. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News, Busan.
A South Korean streaming platform has been tapping into uncharted territory with shows that seek to share the stories of sexual minorities. My colleague Kim Hyun-sung has this tale of 2 shows.
안녕하세요. 저는 남자를 좋아하는 남자.
여자에서 남자로 성별 정정 준비 중인
지금은 레즈비언이라고
동성애자로
양성애자입니다.
It's a story about love, but love that has not been seen on South Korean screens. Korean OTT service Wave last Friday launched its first ever queer reality show, Marry Queer.
할머니 보면 쓰러져. 아니야. 쓰러진다고. 아직 한국은 안 돼.
The show Marry Queer features happy couples who also want to marry. But their plan to take their relationship to the next level is often met with roadblocks.
엄마가 자식 얘기만 나오면 엄마 할 말이 없어.
나는 엄마가 처음에 이해해줄 줄 알았거든.
차라리 내가 죽어버릴까? 내가 이걸 어떻게 안고 살지? 어디서부터 잘못됐는지도 모르겠고.
And this Friday, Wave is to launch another reality show called His Man. It's a dating show just with men. In the space of a week, Wave has pushed far past the boundaries set by South Korean media by featuring those in the LGBTQ community.
We created this show because we realized that there were only shows that dramatized their lives, but nothing that showed a real, vivid depiction of their lives.
Teens and people in their 20s don't have much aversion to queer content, so OTT platforms whose target audiences are teens to 30-somethings are more boldly trying to create this content featuring minorities and their stories.
But Wave faced struggles of its own while creating this show. Some within the company voiced concerns, and the shows also received some complaints about featuring people with different sexualities. But according to Wave, Marry Queer became the 4th most popular show that new accounts watched first. And Wave is looking to venture into creating more content that stars minorities.
We can't meet and communicate with all types of minorities in our lifetime. That's where such content comes into play a big part. We can experience indirectly what it's like to be a minority, and that could mature and open up more people.
These shows are the first of their kind. But as media always moves forward in its search for fresh new content, they won't be the last. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In Sri Lanka, it's been reported that the president who fled the country earlier this week has now resigned. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa gave notice of his resignation in an email sent to Sri Lanka's parliamentary speaker. Sources say the email was sent moments after Rajapaksa landed in Singapore on Thursday. This follows the president previously fleeing to the Maldives amid anti-government protests in Sri Lanka. It's believed he left Sri Lanka in an attempt to avoid possible arrest under a new administration. According to the Speaker's office, if the legality of the email is verified, an announcement will be made on Friday morning local time. News of the resignation has delighted demonstrators, with many dancing in the streets. Meanwhile, Singapore has said that Rajapaksa was allowed to enter the country on a, quote, private visit and has not requested asylum. Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi has offered up his resignation after the largest party in Italy's coalition government withdrew its support. The resignation offer came on Thursday after Five Star boycotted a vote on the government's economic aid package. The Populist Party claimed Draghi's measures didn't do enough to tackle living costs. Although Draghi's vote passed comfortably, he had previously insisted that the coalition would not continue without support from Five Star. However, Italian President Sergio Mattarella rejected the PM's resignation, requesting that he stay and address the parliament. Meanwhile, the former leader of Five Star, Luigi Di Maio, accused the party of trying to bring down the government to bring back its own support. Gang violence in the Haitian capital of Port-au-Prince has seen a reported 89 killed in the span of a week. Over 100 others have been injured. This comes as two gangs, G9 and GPEP, are fighting over control over the impoverished neighborhood of Cité Soleil. A report by a local human rights group said on Wednesday that of those killed, 47 were identified as gang members, while the remaining 42 were civilians caught in the crossfire. According to Doctors Without Borders, the violence has cut off access to food, water and fuel for thousands of residents, and the streets are lined with dozens of burnt corpses. Gang violence in Haiti has surged since the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse last year. After more than a century, a hidden self-portrait by Vincent van Gogh has been discovered behind one of his paintings. The portrait was found last week on Friday when art conservators took an X-ray of Van Gogh's 1885 head of a peasant woman. According to experts, the portrait has been unknown to the art world until now. It was covered by layers of glue and cardboard, as Van Gogh frequently reused canvases to save money. The portrait depicts a bearded man in a brimmed hat with a neckerchief loosely tied at the throat. Thousands of troops from France and its allies in Central and Eastern Europe marched down the Champs-Élysées Avenue in Paris on Thursday as France celebrated Bastille Day. The parade featured warplanes, military vehicles and a drone performance to put France's military might on display while voicing support for Ukraine. Troops from NATO members such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland led the parade bearing their national flags. Abnormally high temperatures did nothing to stop crowds from watching the display in the French capital. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Friday afternoon. It seems like the heat wave is sticking around in the country, with Seoul reaching 30 and Daegu 34 degrees. And as the humidity increases the feeling of heat, it feels even hotter than it actually is. So your priority has to be to stay cool and hydrated. Well, today, most inland regions are expected to have showers from later today, and overnight, the northeastern part of the country will have showers of up to 60 millimeters, which could be accompanied by stormy conditions or hail. And Jeju Island will experience of rain up to 80 millimeters with a newly issued heavy rain advisory. Now, southern regions are dealing with extreme heat. As you can see, healers covering almost all of Gyeongsang-do and Jeollanam-do provinces and even Chungcheongbuk-do province. It shouldn't be taken lightly, so take precautions to avoid heat-related illnesses. And we're about to wrap up the week with oppressively hot weather with frequent showers in some inland regions. And the monsoon will start again, centered in southern areas and Jeju Island. Have a great weekend, and now let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
On that note, we end our editions of the Daily Report for this week. We'll be back with more coverage starting on Monday. See you then.